Okay, so this part of the lecture is going to cover chapter 6 of Even the Rat Was White. It's going to cover the education, the training, the employment, as well as the organization of Black psychologists. So in the beginning of the chapter, they talk about the United States being a training ground for Black psychologists at that time. So remember when we talked about in the last chapter, you had all these different, you had a lot of HBCUs popping up with courses in psychology, formulating interest in psychology among students. So you had a lot of um, folks from these colleges doing their best to move on into the field of psychology. And what you found were a lot of barriers uh, when it came to that training. So the book talks about it being as a good fortune, quote unquote. And as a Black graduate student at that time, it was really hard because a lot of the colleges that admitted Black graduate students were predominantly white, and they had to have the ability to negotiate on campus of PWIs. So while they were in these classes with that was predominantly white, they also had to navigate um, their academic courses and their training, right? So there were three major factors that were cited in this chapter as barriers to graduate training in psychology for Black folks. Geography was a big one. And if you think about it, that does make sense. A lot of universities did not accept Black graduate students, did not accept Black students at all. So the very few that did might have been way in the north. And if you were someone away from the south, that's very, very far. That's away from your family. And then also that puts a weight on your finances. But more about that later. Another one was about policies. So depending upon the university that that student was at, if they were a Black student, they might have had to get an additional degree to validate their abilities, right? So that's also taxing. When it came to getting the degree, being in that program, it was really hard. And the pursuit of that degree was a struggle. A lot of Black folks that did have that idea of pursuing a graduate degree in psychology, they either lowered their ambition or they pursued a different degree. So taken together, when it came to, well, I'll be clear about this. To obtain the training as a psychologist and to become a psychologist at this point in time in America was not easy for anybody. However, we see an additional stressor amongst Black folks who are trying to train to become a psychologist. So I mentioned this on the last slide. Financial funds was our lack of financial funds was a very big barrier to Black graduate students, right? Like I mentioned before, if you have a school that's in the north that has accepted you and you're in the deep south, that's a lot. That calls for a lot of resources, a lot of money. And often you had philanthropic, that stuff, provide financial resources. And while there were a lot, your book talked about a lot, one of the ones that was heavily discussed was the Julius Rosenwald Foundation. Now, this particular foundation was like at the forefront of the private sector in advocating for Black students in academia, especially within psychology. there was pushes not only to train, but to hire Black graduate students, especially those who were psychologists. And this particular foundation was very effective at promoting and advocating uh, for the employment and the training of Black graduate students. While this was one of the many funding sources, it did end in 1946, or excuse me, 1948, and after that you had it was you had other. I'll be clear, you did have other funding resources from the private sector, but this was one of the most notable. Oh, and FYI, it was terminated in 1948. It just came to me. So we talked about the training. Now we got to talk about the employment. When it came to psychology courses, they were like very popular at HBCUs. Every HBCU provided at least one course in psychology as early as 1906. And at that point in time, those who were formally trained, they were like premium, mainly because the training, when it came to training psychologists, remember I said like there's a lot that goes on into training. And at that point in time, it's important to note that the people that were teaching psychology often were, they held degrees in education, religion, sociology, physics. And when it came to Black professors, Black scholars, they did report having a frustrating time at these not at these colleges, but teaching at these colleges. There wasn't a lot of incentive. The salaries weren't that great. There was heavy teaching loads, little job security, and as far as the retirement plans, they were very meager. So if you read in that chapter, it was very disheartening at that point in time for Black scholars, Black professors. However, when we looked into the employment and research within the military and the assessment within the military, you saw a lot more opportunities for Black psychologists. So government services provided opportunities for Black psychologists to practice and do research. And because they were practicing in these fields, it allowed the public to see their presence, and that was really important. At that point, Black psychologists wanted to make their presence known, and there was a lot of incentive for organization. And the incentive was mainly centered around the traditional professional approaches to the problems of Black Americans in the community, right? So one of the governing bodies of psychologists is the American Psychological Association, or APA. At that point in time, APA was very complicit in the exploitation of Black Americans. Remember, there was this big emphasis on comparative research. So what a lot of Black psychologists were seeing, they were concerned about it, obviously. And with this concern and this lack of attention from APA, there was this formation of their own organization, the American Teachers Association. And this was an effective voice for Black teachers, especially those who are psychologists, and discussing common interests and concerns. Now, there were talks about conferences being held, but what ultimately put it off was like the beginning of World War II. But it wasn't until 30 years later that we that we found this discontentment again. And this time there was a lot more voice to it. Such that, excuse me, I was dying over here. Once again, at that point in time, there was this growing discontentment with APA, and it really wasn't. It had died down a little bit when the Society, a Psychological Study of Social Issues Society, it's a division in APA. They came out and said, like, hey, I think we need to focus on the training and needs of Black psychologists, and that did decrease some of that discontentment, but the former organization, as a result of that, deteriorated. And it wasn't until you saw the formation of the Association of Black Psychologists come up that you saw Black psychologists organizing again. And one of those who were who were leading in it was Joseph White. And the way that this group organized itself was through a mailing list. And it was called the National Association of Black Psychologists. Charles Thomas and Robert Greene were like the co-chairs. Ernestine Thomas was the secretary. And their voice, they voiced concerns about racial integration within the psychological workforce, APA's facilitation to the entry of more Black Americans into graduate schools, and monitoring journals and establishing programs where minority concerns should be expressed. So with the National Association of Black Psychologists, their formation was mainly centered around creating a space for that conversation. And you saw a lot of passion in this concern when Joseph White and several others, they interrupted George Miller's presidential address. And I'll be clear, it also was a bunch of graduate students too. Now, while there were like clutching of pearls, this wake-up call, in essence, like woke up APA at this point, and they were like, oh, this is something serious. So we see that the organization of Black psychologists created that space to voice those concerns about Black Americans. Now, after that, you did see a shift, right? Specifically towards Black psychology. And there were a lot of people that were concerned about this term because it was viewed as if it was dichotomizing psychology into this Black and white category. And if you think about it too, you had to define what was Black psychology and what was it not. And there was a lot of, while this was going on, you had a lot of debates about what it is, what it is not. So it stimulated a lot of discussions. And during that time of the Black psychology movement, what you had psychological terms that weren't typically used in traditional psychology, but they were used as a matter of necessity to discuss the unique conditions found within the Black experience. So Neanderthalization, democracy, negrescence, just as examples. So that was during the 1970s era, right? 10 years later, you had the Association of Black Psychologists, or ABPSI, placing like major emphasis on Afrocentric discourse, spiritual rejuvenation, and cultural themes coming from African religions and philosophies. At the same time, you also had psychologists who were formulating Afrocentric approaches within psychology too. So as this change was happening, you also had the debate, you also had critique on Black psychology. Amina Mama provided their stance on it, suggesting that neither Eurocentric nor Afrocentric philosophies are able to really withstand that paradigm shift. However, and I will be very blunt about it, with this shift in Black psychology, what we do know about what we have about Black psychology so far is that it's we see more of the principles in diasporic research studies. So if you look at traditional psychology and Black psychology, they both, there's some differences. Obviously, there's some differences. Traditional psychology has had many years in its development, whereas Black psychology, it wasn't. Black psychology is still relatively young compared to traditional psychology, and that's something to make note. And during that point in time, you had Black psychologists who were trained in the traditional approaches, and they also were in the discourse of Black psychology. And what you found is that they could integrate both, right? And I do want to make note that Black psychologists who were trained in traditional approaches to psychology, they provided groundbreaking research. Kenneth and Mamie Clark, if you haven't heard of them before. So their study really showed the impact of segregation on the developmental aspects of Black kids. And that study was the study that it played a very big role in the Supreme Court for Brown versus Board of Education, actually. And it really appealed, not appealed, but it played like a major role in the court's decision to reverse separate but equal. So I want to be clear, and the way that I would like folks to understand is that the shifting towards a Black psychology, that's really important. That was an important paradigm shift, and it's still occurring. And I want to be clear about that. The Black psychology is still growing. And it's also important to recognize the ways in which Black psychologists were using their training in traditional approaches to show the ways in which psychology can produce like some very big changes in this country. If you look at Mamie and Ken Clark's study, that was able to facilitate social change, racial integration, really. So taken together within this chapter, we talked about the training, employment, and organization of Black psychologists. What we did see, we talked about the factors that impeded upon the training, and even some of the struggles that Black psychologists had working within predominantly white institutions and at HBCUs and within their own governing body of APA.